The room went dead silent the moment she said it. No punchline. No laughter. Just a slow, deliberate pause from a woman Hollywood has spent decades branding as sunshine, laughter, and effortless charm. Because at 79 years old, Goldie Hawn finally stopped protecting the myth. And what she exposed sent shockwaves straight through classic Hollywood's carefully polished legacy. These weren't vague hints. These weren't cute anecdotes. These were names. Patterns. Behaviors that were hidden in plain sight for decades while careers were built, Oscars were handed out, and reputations were scrubbed clean. Goldie didn't frame it as revenge. She framed it as survival. According to people close to her, she reached a point where nostalgia stopped feeling harmless and started feeling dishonest. Behind the glamour, the champagne, the black and white photos, there were stars whose smiles masked cruelty, manipulation, and power plays so ruthless they'd end careers before breakfast. And Goldie saw it all. At parties. On sets. In rooms where young actors learned very quickly who was untouchable and who was disposable. The most chilling part. She claims these weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns everyone knew about and nobody challenged. 6 legendary figures. 6 carefully protected reputations. And 6 stories that were never meant to be told by someone with this much credibility, this much longevity, and absolutely nothing left to lose. Hollywood wants you to remember the magic. Goldie Hawn wants you to understand the cost. Because once you hear who she's talking about, and what she says they did, you'll never look at the golden age the same way again. Goldie Hawn didn't walk into this moment looking for chaos. According to people close to her, it arrived quietly, almost accidentally, during what was supposed to be a nostalgic reflection on her career. But nostalgia has a way of cracking open truths that were never meant to age well. At 79, Goldie no longer speaks like someone auditioning for approval. She speaks like someone who survived a system that smiled while it sharpened its knives. And when she began describing the people she calls the darkest forces behind the brightest lights, Hollywood's golden age suddenly looked a lot less golden. She didn't start with names. She started with atmosphere. Rooms where laughter was currency and silence was survival. Sets where power dynamics were unspoken, but understood instantly. According to Goldie, there were stars whose reputations were built on charm, so convincing it felt dangerous. Not because they were openly cruel, but because they were adored. Protected. Untouchable. She described one legendary leading man, who ruled sets through fear disguised as perfectionism. Miss a mark, and he'd humiliate you publicly. Push back, and suddenly your scenes were cut. Careers stalled. Invitations stopped coming. Everyone knew. No one challenged him. Goldie said the cruelty wasn't loud, it was surgical. Then she spoke about a celebrated actress, revered as an icon of grace and elegance. On camera, flawless. Off camera, calculated. Goldie alleged this woman destroyed other women quietly, never raising her voice, never leaving fingerprints. She'd spread doubt, question competence, suggest someone was difficult in the right ears. Goldie described watching young actresses crumble, convinced they were the problem, never realizing they were being erased strategically. According to her, this woman's greatest weapon wasn't rage, it was respectability. Because no one believes the villain when the villain looks like royalty. As Goldie continued, the pattern became impossible to ignore. She wasn't talking about monsters hiding in shadows. She was talking about stars hiding in plain sight. One figure she described was a powerful producer-turned-performer, who treated human beings like props. According to Goldie, he'd pit actors against each other deliberately, whispering contradictory promises, fostering competition, so toxic it kept everyone compliant. If you resisted, you were labeled ungrateful. If you spoke up, you were unprofessional. Goldie said she watched this man derail careers not with threats, but with smiles and selective silence. The room reportedly shifted when she described the fourth figure, a Hollywood darling known for warmth, humor, and an everyman appeal. Goldie claimed this person's darkness was emotional, not explosive. He manipulated through dependency. He'd build people up only to withdraw approval suddenly, leaving them desperate to regain his favor. According to Goldie, this kind of power was especially destructive, because it made victims blame themselves. They thought they'd failed. They hadn't. They'd been controlled. What made these revelations hit harder wasn't just the behavior, it was the complicity. Goldie made it clear that these figures thrived, because the system rewarded them. Studios looked away. Agents rationalized. Co-stars stayed silent. And the reason, she implied, was simple: everyone was afraid of becoming expendable. Hollywood didn't just enable cruelty, it monetized it. Goldie said there was an unspoken rule during her early years: endure now, succeed later. And if you couldn't endure, you didn't belong. She paused before speaking about the fifth figure, and according to witnesses, that pause said everything. This one, she said, was the most confusing. A mentor. Someone who offered guidance, protection, opportunity. Until the protection came with conditions. Goldie was careful with her words here, describing a dynamic where gratitude was expected to turn into loyalty, silence, and obedience. She said the betrayal wasn't in what this person did, it was in what they expected others to tolerate in exchange for advancement. Lines blurred. Boundaries dissolved. And if you objected, you were reminded how easily you could be replaced. By the time she reached the sixth figure, the tone shifted from revelation to reckoning. This person, she said, embodied the system itself. Not a single act of cruelty, but a lifetime of influence used to protect abusers, bury stories, and rewrite narratives. According to Goldie, this was someone whose legacy was built not just on talent, but on gatekeeping. Someone who decided whose careers survived and whose didn't. Someone who taught others how to weaponize prestige. Goldie didn't describe this person with anger. She described them with clarity. And clarity, in Hollywood, is dangerous. What shocked listeners most was Goldie's refusal to cast herself as a hero. She admitted she survived by adapting. By choosing battles. By staying quiet when speaking would have cost her everything. She said that truth without context is unfair, because fear shapes behavior. And fear was the real currency of classic Hollywood. Fear of being labeled. Fear of losing work. Fear of not being believed. Goldie said she carried those stories for decades, telling herself it was over, that times had changed. But the older she got, the heavier the silence felt. Social media exploded as fragments of her comments spread. Fans argued over who she might be referring to. Old interviews were dissected. Classic films re-watched with suspicion. People realized how many difficult actresses had disappeared abruptly. How many promising careers ended without explanation. Goldie's words didn't accuse directly, they illuminated patterns. And patterns are harder to dismiss than allegations. According to insiders, the reason Goldie finally spoke wasn't bitterness. It was responsibility. She reportedly said she didn't want to be remembered as someone who benefited from silence without acknowledging its cost. That Hollywood nostalgia often erases the damage done behind the scenes. That smiling photos don't tell the whole story. And that pretending the past was harmless only ensures its mistakes repeat. By the end of her remarks, the room wasn't applauding. It was processing. Because what Goldie exposed wasn't six evil individuals in isolation. It was a culture that rewarded cruelty when it came wrapped in talent. A system that protected stars while sacrificing people. And as fans scrambled to connect dots, one thing became clear: this wasn't the full story. Goldie had opened a door, not walked through it. And according to those closest to her, what she hasn't said yet may be even more unsettling than what she already revealed. Once Goldie Hawn's words escaped the room, they took on a life of their own. What began as a reflective moment quickly metastasized into a full-blown reckoning, not because she named names, but because she described behaviors so precisely that Hollywood's past began to feel uncomfortably searchable. Insiders say executives immediately started making calls. Publicists went into containment mode. And longtime industry veterans reportedly recognized themselves, or their mentors, in her descriptions faster than they were willing to admit. Goldie didn't frame these figures as villains twirling mustaches. She framed them as architects of fear. People who understood leverage better than morality. One of the most unsettling details she shared, according to attendees, was how normalized the behavior felt at the time. She said no one ever announced the rules. You learned them by watching who disappeared. One wrong refusal. One complaint to the wrong person. Suddenly your calls stopped getting returned. Scripts dried up. Invitations vanished. And the message was clear without being spoken: survival required compliance. As her comments circulated, old stories resurfaced that suddenly made sense. Actors who had been labeled temperamental in the 1970s. Actresses whose careers ended abruptly after one breakout role. Goldie allegedly referenced watching this pattern repeat itself over and over, always with the same explanation offered publicly: they just couldn't handle the pressure. Behind the scenes, she claims, pressure wasn't the problem. Control was. She described one star, whose cruelty thrived on plausible deniability. Never screamed. Never threatened. Instead, he'd calmly suggest that someone wasn't ready yet, knowing full well that those words, coming from him, were a career death sentence. Goldie said she watched casting decisions change midstream, because this person had concerns. Concerns that were never documented. Never questioned. Just accepted. Because challenging him meant risking your own future. Another figure she referenced allegedly perfected the art of triangulation. According to Goldie, this person thrived on turning colleagues against one another, ensuring no one ever felt secure enough to speak up collectively. Compliments were used sparingly. Disapproval was implied, never explicit. People spent years trying to earn approval that was never intended to be given. Goldie said the psychological toll of this environment was enormous. People doubted their talent, their instincts, their worth. And because the manipulation was subtle, it was nearly impossible to prove. What disturbed listeners most was Goldie's insistence that many of these individuals were celebrated precisely because of these traits. Perfectionism was praised. Intensity was rewarded. Ruthlessness was reframed as genius. She said Hollywood loved results and didn't ask questions about the cost. If a film succeeded, the behavior behind it was justified retroactively. And if someone got hurt along the way, they were told that was the price of greatness. Goldie also touched on the gendered nature of the cruelty. She claimed women paid a steeper price for resistance. While men were allowed to be difficult, women were branded ungrateful. She described watching female peers gaslit into apologizing for setting boundaries. Told they were lucky to be there. Reminded constantly of how replaceable they were. According to Goldie, the message was relentless: your value ends where your compliance does. As speculation intensified online, fans began connecting Goldie's comments to infamous moments in Hollywood history. Explosive on-set arguments. Sudden recastings. Long-time feuds that never quite made sense. Goldie's words reframed these events not as isolated incidents, but as symptoms of a system that rewarded intimidation. And the more people talked, the clearer it became that these stories weren't rare. They were routine. Insiders claim Goldie was warned, gently but firmly, that speaking further could complicate things. That revisiting the past might open doors no one could close again. According to sources, her response was blunt: complicated doesn't mean false. She reportedly said that pretending everything was fine had done more damage than the truth ever could. That protecting legacies without acknowledging harm only perpetuated the cycle. One of the most chilling moments came when Goldie reportedly acknowledged her own compromises. She admitted there were times she stayed quiet when she shouldn't have. Times she laughed things off to keep working. Times she chose self-preservation over solidarity. That admission landed hard, because it dismantled the idea that survival required moral purity. Goldie wasn't presenting herself as blameless. She was presenting herself as honest. That honesty ignited a second wave of reaction. Younger actors began sharing stories eerily similar to what Goldie described. Different decades. Same dynamics. Power concentrated in the hands of a few. Silence enforced. Through fear. Fans realized that the classic Hollywood Goldie was describing didn't disappear. It evolved. The names changed. The methods adapted. But the structure remained intact. As debates raged, some defenders accused Goldie of rewriting history, of judging the past by modern standards. She pushed back against that narrative indirectly, according to those present. She argued that cruelty was never acceptable. It was simply tolerated. And tolerance, she suggested, is a choice, one the industry made repeatedly, because it benefited those at the top. By the end of this phase of the fallout, one thing was undeniable: Goldie had shifted the conversation from nostalgia to accountability. She wasn't asking for statues to be torn down. She was asking for honesty. For acknowledgement that talent and harm can coexist. That success doesn't absolve behavior. And that pretending otherwise only ensures the same patterns resurface under new faces. Hollywood responded the only way it knows how at first, with silence. No official rebuttals. No confirmations. Just a collective pause. And in that pause, speculation grew louder. Because Goldie hadn't finished speaking. She'd made that clear. According to insiders, there were more stories she chose not to share yet. Not because they were less severe, but because they implicated too many people at once. As the dust settled, fans were left with an unsettling realization. Goldie's revelations weren't about 6 individuals alone. They were about a culture that trained people to look away. And if that culture was never dismantled, then the golden age wasn't an era that ended. It was a template that keeps getting reused. And what Goldie was preparing to reveal next, according to those closest to her, would make that connection impossible to ignore. By the time the third phase of Goldie Hawn's revelations began circulating, the conversation had shifted from shock to fear. Not public fear, industry fear. Because what she was exposing wasn't limited to a handful of bad actors. It was a survival manual everyone had been trained to follow, whether they admitted it or not. And once people realized that, the silence from Hollywood stopped feeling accidental. It felt coordinated. According to insiders, Goldie made it clear she wasn't interested in public trials or retroactive punishment. She wasn't trying to tear down monuments. What unsettled people was that she was dismantling the excuse that everyone did the best they could back then. She described a system that didn't just allow cruelty, it required it. One where careers advanced not by talent alone, but by who you didn't challenge. Who you didn't embarrass. Who you didn't expose. She allegedly described the final two figures not as outliers, but as instructors. People who taught others how to operate in Hollywood without ever getting their hands dirty. They didn't need to yell or threaten. They modeled behavior. They showed younger stars how to punish quietly, how to retaliate invisibly, how to make someone disappear without ever being accused of doing so. Goldie suggested that this knowledge was passed down like tradecraft. And once learned, it was rarely unlearned. What made this final section of her commentary especially chilling was her insistence that many people still revered these figures sincerely. Not because they were ignorant, but because they'd built their success inside the same rules. Goldie reportedly said that when harm benefits you, acknowledging it feels like self-indictment. So people rewrite history instead. They call it passion. They call it genius. They call it how things were. Anything but what it actually was. She also addressed the myth that time alone heals damage. According to Goldie, the passage of decades doesn't erase harm, it just buries it under nostalgia. She spoke about people she'd worked with who never recovered. Talented individuals who left the industry convinced they weren't good enough, when in reality, they'd been pushed out for refusing to tolerate abuse. Goldie said the most dangerous lie Hollywood tells is that those people simply weren't cut out for it. As word spread, the public response began to change. The initial obsession with guessing names gave way to something heavier. Viewers started questioning the stories they'd accepted for years. Why certain careers ended abruptly. Why some actors vanished after clashing with powerful figures. Why others thrived despite reputations everyone privately acknowledged. Goldie hadn't provided a list, she'd provided a lens. And once people looked through it, they couldn't unsee what came into focus. Insiders say Goldie anticipated the backlash. She knew there would be accusations of bitterness, exaggeration, revisionism. She addressed that indirectly by emphasizing her own success. She didn't speak as someone who failed. She spoke as someone who won, and still saw the cost. According to those present, she said surviving the system doesn't make it just. It just means you learned how to navigate injustice without being crushed by it. One of the most haunting moments came when Goldie reportedly acknowledged the role admiration plays in protecting harm. She said audiences love their icons so much that they resist any information that complicates the fantasy. Because if the people who made us laugh, cry, and dream were also capable of cruelty, then the art becomes harder to enjoy. Goldie wasn't asking people to stop loving the work. She was asking them to stop pretending the work erased the damage done around it. Behind the scenes, industry reactions grew more defensive. According to sources, there were private conversations about protecting legacies and keeping things in perspective. Goldie's supporters interpreted that as proof of her point. Because perspective, when used selectively, becomes a shield. It minimizes harm by contextualizing it until it disappears. Goldie reportedly said that context should explain behavior, not excuse it. The conversation also forced a reckoning around complicity. Not just among the powerful, but among peers. Goldie suggested that silence wasn't always cowardice, sometimes it was survival. But she also acknowledged that survival has consequences. When too many people choose it, harm becomes normalized. And that normalization is what allowed the same patterns to persist long after the so-called golden age ended. As more people weighed in, it became clear that Goldie's revelations resonated because they aligned with experiences across generations. Younger actors recognized the dynamics immediately. Different language. Same outcomes. Careers shaped by fear of being labeled difficult. Boundaries treated as obstacles. Power concentrated so tightly that resistance felt futile. Goldie's stories didn't feel historical. They felt current. Insiders say the most unsettling part of her message was what she implied about the future. That without intentional disruption, the industry would continue to reward the same behaviors under new branding. That progress isn't automatic, it's enforced. And that enforcement requires discomfort. Goldie didn't claim to have all the answers. She claimed the questions had been ignored for too long. As the dust settled, Hollywood's response remained muted. No public reckoning. No sweeping admissions. Just a quiet recalibration. And that, according to observers, may be the most telling outcome of all. Because when truth doesn't provoke denial, outrage, or correction, when it's met with stillness, it suggests recognition. Goldie Hawn didn't expose 6 evil stars as caricatures. She exposed 6 roles the industry kept casting: the tyrant disguised as a perfectionist, the saboteur cloaked in elegance, the manipulator behind a smile, the gatekeeper, who decided who mattered, the mentor who demanded silence as loyalty, and the architect who taught everyone else how to get away with it. Those roles, she implied, are more dangerous than any single name. And that's why this moment lingers. Because Goldie didn't burn Hollywood down. She held up a mirror. And the reflection isn't flattering. It's complicated. Uncomfortable. Impossible to dismiss without effort. Whether the industry chooses to look away again remains to be seen. But one thing is clear, the illusion of a harmless golden age has cracked. And once that crack exists, it keeps spreading, no matter how carefully people try to paint over it. If you're still here, it's because you can feel it. This wasn't just a story about the past, it was a warning about how power really works when nobody's watching. Goldie Hawn didn't name names for a reason. Because once you understand the patterns, the names start revealing themselves on their own. And that's what makes this moment dangerous. Not for audiences, for the industry that's relied on nostalgia, silence, and selective memory for far too long. This conversation does not end here. It's only beginning. If this breakdown made you rethink the legends you grew up admiring, hit like so this video reaches the people who still believe the golden age was harmless. Drop a comment, because the comment section is where the real reckoning happens. What stood out to you, what dots you're connecting, and what questions you think Hollywood still refuses to answer. And subscribe right now, because stories like this don't come with neat conclusions. They unfold in layers, in reactions, in quiet confirmations that surface weeks or months later. Missing the next chapter means missing the context. And without context, the truth gets rewritten again. This channel exists to pull apart the myths, not just repeat headlines. To look at power, silence, and legacy without flinching. And when someone with nothing left to lose finally decides to speak, history shifts, whether people admit it or not. Stay locked in. Because the most important part of stories like this isn't what was exposed, it's who responds next, and who stays silent.